talk a bit about our experiences of creating art in places in southern Manitoulin Island and us in Norfolk County. I guess Claire and I can kind of jump into our experience of creating a theater company in Norfolk and what that journey was like and why it happened and things of that sort. So let's introduce our company. Do you want to take that?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And if you have things to say, please, like, we want this to be a conversation. So if you're like, oh man, that reminds me of the time I did this and we did it differently. So, like, please tell us, because that's interesting and that's why we're doing this.
Yeah.
So,
It's the Robies.
Hey, Robies. Our company is Rural Stages Productions. Well, actually, Ryan, do you want to talk about how Rural Stages came to be?
Sure.
Basically, Rural Stages Productions, our sort of theater company, it's a theater company based in Norfolk County, essentially dedicated to community engagement and involvement. So it's creating exciting new professional theater that utilizes both people from Toronto, where I'm from, and Montreal, where Ryan lives, and city, and bringing them to Norfolk, and also using the artists in Norfolk, because there are a lot of incredible artists in Norfolk, and so just combining the two and all of their various skill sets to create professional theater.
Because along those lines, and we'll talk more about this, I guess, later, is like one of the main reasons for that was, I guess, twofold, at least, where we've had previous companies very similar to ours start up in Norfolk County particularly, where they would bring in an entire cast and crew from Toronto, work on the show there, and then bring it down to Norfolk and then present it. And they would work for a little bit of time, and then it would they tended to fizzle out.
Yeah.
And what we're starting to find is that, of course, people tend to want to watch and want to engage with something that they are somehow related to. So we're finding the more community, an immediate community relationship that we had with either the show, with the people who were in the show, or the type of content or something like that, the more the community was willing to be a part of that, because it's for them, there's something that they can connect to. So
there's been a history of really brilliant artists coming to Norfolk and putting on shows, and we're just kind of learning from what they did, essentially. And we kind of go, okay, that's why that might not have worked, let's do something different.
And I think that the biggest lesson being, how do they relate? So we make sure that we are incorporating the community in creating a professional show. Because there aren't a lot of established professional artists in Norfolk, in theater particularly.
No.
There's not a lot of opportunity there to do professional theater. There is one professional theater in Port Dover, and everybody comes from outside of Dover to work there.
Yeah. And it does a particular type of theater. Like,
right.
it's a summer kind of season, it's your summer stop, like farces and Norman Foster and comedies and stuff like that. So there isn't a lot of, which is wonderful, but Norfolk in general doesn't have a large variety of the type of theater that you'd see that you would expect, like, living in a city. And I know that growing up, I didn't have a lot of opportunities. Like, theater in general was not considered a serious thing, or a serious profession that you could enter into. To the extent where I don't even remember when I just made the decision to apply to theater schools. I have no idea, really. But, like, our high school drama teacher was hired to coach the football team. And they were just like, well, I guess we need a drama teacher, so I guess you can, go. And he didn't have a single clue what he was doing.
Because anybody can teach drama.
Exactly, well, exactly, yeah. And so I think another part of our company's mandate is to be like, hey, let's, down the road, what we really want to aim to do is, like, try to involve youth, especially from the schools, to be like, and to bring in professionals from outside, being like, hey, this is a viable career option. You can do this. Look at these people doing this. They're from your hometown. You can make a living. Watch us do this. And hopefully that's inspiring to people.
It's difficult to bloom where you grow when you have very little support. If I had a hockey stick in my hand, I'd be worth a fortune today. This is Dance Ontario offered my school board $5,000 to to bring me in on professional development days because I'm an AQ dance specialist from UT.
Really?
They handed them free money. And the teachers want to learn how to use time, energy, space, and shape to create movement. We know it's not the troika and the alley cat anymore. So that's a very interesting point. And the other thing is, it's very difficult to mix the professional with the amateur if you're trying to get your craft out there to interest people. If they're not paying for it, I find sometimes they just don't show up. Do you find this?
It's like an audience coming?
Yeah.
If there was no, sorry, what do you mean exactly by
if
they're
they're
not
not
paying
paying for dance lessons or voice lessons or piano lessons, and somebody is offering their skill, oh, I'm going to choreograph Annie, so everybody come on out, they're not really that dedicated because they haven't put anything out of pocket. That's right.
Right, so there's no like consequence to not participating if they, for whatever reason, don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is, and
So
I
we're
feel like
trying
this is
to,
what across
that's
the
a
board.
beautiful expression, but it's very difficult in Northern Ontario.
Yeah.
I want to open with an anecdote. I spent 3 months in teachers college, and we were told never start with an anecdote. So I'm going to do that. So Levac, where I live, is an old Inco town. There's like 1,200 people in one town site, another couple thousand in the other nearby town site. All the houses look the same. And I guess I'm the only professional musician who lives in that town. And over the years, like, I've taught some young people guitar, I've done stuff in the school. So a lot of the kids have always known that there's this guy who lives in town and he sometimes goes on the road. And I had 2 high school students come into my house one day, and they had actually called and said, well, can we come over and get some advice about music? And I was great. I'm going to tell these kids what's what. And so they came in, and I kind of sat down and I said, look, this is what I've done. I've really had to learn to be a jack of all trades. I had to learn how to make my own records at home. I've had to take strange gigs like doing weddings and funerals. And I was just kind of going on about saying the only way to really make a living is to be as broad as possible. Saying things like, always say yes. And I talked for maybe 15 minutes, and then the one young guy looked at me and said, yeah, but how do we become rich and famous? And I realized that then and there that success to him and to me, really, when I was young, was measured with wealth and fame. That's how it was measured. And I think no matter how much maturity you have, you still feel that somehow you haven't quite measured up if you can't be measured by your fame and your wealth. And so blooming where you're planted becomes almost for me, it becomes like a test of your own maturity, of your own ability to, actually I wrote down 3 things that I have kind of always tried to remind myself as I go along, and those 3 things are, do you know yourself? Are you aware of your responsibilities to those around you? And here's something I stole from a friend. Are you okay with being satisfied? And the first one I struggle with constantly. And it's the one thing I always try to ask people, do you know yourself? What are your motivations? What are your limitations? What are your aspirations? A lot of people I meet you two are extremely together people.
First time I've heard that.
Well, I mean, it sounds to me like you're approaching your career and your art form. You're not just going out on the road and expecting everything to fall in your lap. In my case, that's what I thought was going to happen. I could relate to those 2 kids who I talked to because when I was in high school, flunking up, I was asked to go see the guidance counselor. I think it was sort of we need to get this kid on the right path because he's completely failing. And I sat down with this guidance counselor who was a very nice man, and he said, what do you want to do? And I was really interested in music, so I might have talked a bit about music. And then he was trying to give me some advice about how to go about it. And I think I said something like, but forget all that. I just want to be a rock star. So I was exactly like the 2 kids I was talking to. I didn't have the maturity to look at a career path or to just kind of Yeah, so those are the three things that I try to remind myself all the time, living in a small community. The are you okay with being satisfied? There's a good friend of mine in Sudbury, an amazing songwriter. And he has about as much interest in being in the music business as, I don't know, like my late great-grandfather. Like, he has zero interest in anything other than just like working in his studio and writing songs. He's written hundreds of songs. His name's John Newlands. And I talked to him once, sort of wanted to do a little essay about his music, and he said that to me. He said, I'm okay with being satisfied. He wasn't interested in all the trappings. So those are my three things I wanted to bring. Was it like, does that make sense to anybody?
I think so. I've actually, when we were talking about this, I remember when we were talking before we came here about like success and things like that, I started doing research on happiness and the measurements of happiness. Happiness in cities, happiness in rural communities, and things of that sort. And there was a statistic that I had heard that for a long time, people were most satisfied, or they found most contentment from their job, up until recently, where that has shifted to where it is that they're living. I can't find the actual study that says that, so basically that's just hearsay. Take it if you want to believe that or not, but the study, yeah, you want to go?
It just triggers a bit of information. If you know the writer Richard Florida, who's a sociologist, researcher, person, who talks about the creative class. And he's written several books. The Rise of the Creative Class was his first book, and it made a huge splash. He writes now, I think, for the Globe and Mail once in a while. And he's teaching in Toronto. But it's that whole idea of people now choose their careers based on where the city in which they're going to live. Mm-hmm. So if the city can offer various things outside of the work hours, then they are going to move there. And he's an American, and he and his wife have chosen to live in Toronto.
Interesting. Yeah,
which is Toronto rates very high.
Yeah.
In his scale, on his scales. The other place in North America that rates very high is Austin, Texas.
Okay.
I'm not sure what it is about Austin, Texas, but anyway. And like the big cities, New York, LA, Chicago, don't rate very high for many reasons.
Interesting. And then that ultimately, I think, also becomes a personal choice.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But like he talks about, if the city has a bike path along the lakeshore or whatever, people will move there.
Yeah. Interesting.
Has nothing to do with the job.
Well, it's about livability, right?
Yes.
It's about like now that more people can work and more people can like contribute to the family, so it's not all about the job. It's about everything else but the job. So if you're living in a place that all you can do is work and all you have is work and there's nothing else, why would you live there? A lot of the time.
Becomes a bedroom.
Yeah.
And that's all.
Yeah. And then taking that and kind of back to the success concept, the other thing that I found in researching this was that typically when their own means and resources increase, their happiness also increases. But if an entire population's resources and access to things or standard of living increases, that population's happiness doesn't also increase. So it seems to suggest an idea of a relativity to others around you, or things of that sort, to judge whether you're doing well or not. So relating that back to success, and this is just me kind of like interpreting this data, I find it interesting with arts particularly, because no matter where you live in North America, as long as you have internet access, as an artist, you get to see the most famous people. And so as an artist, it's really easy to judge yourself against these most famous people and try to relate your success, potentially happiness, against these other folks. Whereas other professions where you may not necessarily see the global impact of some of these things can lead to a different subsect to relate oneself against. So I was wondering if that might be a seed as to the challenge of finding happiness as an artist without self-consideration in a small town, because what one can do in a small town will never be what one is doing on the world stage,
Yeah.
if you compare it directly, but in a whole bunch of different ways, like in a whole bunch of personal ways. There's a very,
It can
there's
be
a
more
very
fulfilling.
different, it can be much more fulfilling, but you have to, I think it takes time to recognize that, or
Yeah.
understand what it is that you actually want to do with your art.
Yeah, it's a shifting of focus, I think.
But on the other hand, though, like you can look at that as inspiration, because I remember growing up in a small town, like there weren't many musicians that I knew, and most of the people playing music around here was just like country and a few things that I didn't really like. But the internet is what got me into music, basically. Like I was downloading like guitar like videos and whatnot, and that was like what really inspired me to play music. And I studied probably more on a computer than anywhere else. Like, and that's why I love the internet still today. Like, I look at YouTube all the time for inspiration. So that's
Yeah.
And that's a generational thing.
Yeah.
I would never go to the internet or YouTube to learn how to play guitar.
Is that because you don't want to, or is that because like?
I would never even think of it.
Yeah, but now that you do, you know what I mean? Like, is that something that you'd be interested in, or is it just something that you're like, I would rather learn hands-on with?
I tried doing an online course once when I was still teaching. Couldn't do it. I have to be in a classroom to learn.
Yeah.
But for example, though,
But, you know, I'm over 30.
but there's certain things that you may never be aware of, like if you didn't have access to the
Oh, yeah.
internet. Like
I'm
I remember,
aware of
like,
it.
When I was 15, I started learning gypsy jazz, and like I was talking to people in my town and even in Sudbury. Like in those years, no one really knew. Like most people didn't know what gypsy jazz was. Like it was the internet that introduced me to that. So like it's so broad. I mean, you can use it as a tool for sure. Like
Yeah.
there is the negative side of like where you're comparing yourself to. But
And maybe even that's like a good jumping point too, of like city versus country, because I know, Kevin, you were talking about this expectation of going to the big smoke, and I think there's something that relates. Like us growing up, Claire and I grew up, and the internet came into existence when we were like, as we were growing up.
Yeah.
So it was developing as we were developing.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like to this degree until we were adults. So our relationship with it is different. And then Kevin, your relationship is going to be different to it as well. But I feel like the city also kind of represents that potential of there's so much opportunity there because there's so many people and so many things. There's so much benefit, but there's also the detriment as well. It's like you're going into a thing where there's like so much more information that's available. But yeah, there's a two-way street that comes with it.
That's what we were talking about when we were talking last night about what like general overview of how we wanted this presentation to go. We came up on the idea of like producing theater. I'm skipping ahead to what we had planned on talking about, but that's where the conversation's going. So like we were talking about the pros and cons of producing theater in the city versus in a rural area. We can say that for after we talk about our show, or
Maybe we can segue into a show through this. Let's give it a go.
yeah.
You want to say something?
Well, if you want, so there was like, it sounds like there's like 3 little threads starting here. You know, my idea of being okay with being satisfied relates to where it is you're living and working in the world. Because when you look at it in terms of are you okay with being satisfied, it doesn't matter whether you're in Levack or you're in New York City, because you are always you're going to find yourself compromising all the time. And so you're going to have to ask yourself, am I okay with being satisfied? But the other thread that Jamie brought up was the idea of networks. Because I also wrote down a thing about how, you know, really success can be measured by how well you're connected. If you're isolated, it's going to be very difficult to bloom at all. And so the internet has changed all that. You can now teach yourself and you can connect with people all over the world. But even if you didn't have the internet, if your community was connected to other communities, you know, even through organizations like SPARC, you're going to find yourself, you're going to find it's easier to grow and to be satisfied.
I think that's a good segue and a good point into like talking about, because our theater company did our first show last year. We did a musical called The Last 5 Years. And it went very well. We worked really hard. It was a year-long process. And we ended up selling like 98% of the tickets, and we were able to pay our artists and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of the time it was, I think, the success of our show came from the fact that we did it in our hometowns where we were connected. And we worked really hard to utilize every single connection that we had created. And we'd known these people sometimes since we were born.
Yeah, and that idea of connectivity, or like whatever network that you have. I'm sure we could apply the same concept to anywhere, to a city, to the internet. The idea of the community, and I guess the utilization of blooming where you're planted, is that, yes, we've spent 20 plus years fostering relationships with very specific people and building trust amongst a very specific community. So when we come to that community and are like, we want to do something, can you help us here? We don't have to build those relationships, or we don't have to convince these people that they can trust us and that it's worth their time helping us, because that's already in place, which is one of the benefits of like growing up small town, and then or just being in a particular community for an extensive period of time.
I asked earlier, before we came here, about the weirdest gig you've ever said yes to. I have a very weird gig I've said yes to, and this to me comes from another thing I wrote down about compromise. You know, I've always resisted compromise. I've always hated it. I always had this image of myself, where I want to be and who I want to be, and I just, as soon as I kind of started to have like something you could call a career, 99% of what I was doing was compromise. And it took me years to finally sort of turn compromises into opportunities and to make it about personal satisfaction and not about success. And one of the weirdest gigs I ever, well actually, the weirdest gigs I do are usually funerals. And I don't do too much of them anymore. It's not to say I wouldn't say yes to singing a funeral if the money was okay. The weirdest one I ever did was singing Cher's Do You Believe in Life After Love. When I first heard the song, I thought, how am I supposed to sing this sort of disco song about breakups at this poor woman's funeral? But that's the song they wanted. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to, like, Jamie, you're the master at this, because you take songs that I never would have thought could be beautiful, and you make them incredible. And I thought, I'm going to do like this guitar, voice, singer-songwriter, weirdly tuned version of this Cher song. And I'm going to play this at this funeral. And that's the way I approached it. You know, I didn't approach it like, I wasn't humiliated anymore about playing a funeral. The weirdest gig I said no to, I should have said yes to because it ruins my story, was being asked, getting a call from Jerry Lougheed Jr., who is our funeral director in Sudbury, and he wanted me to sing Styx's Mr. Roboto at a funeral. And this was this guy had passed away, and it was his favorite song. And I talked to Jerry, and I said, I can't do it. I mean, it can't be done. Because, do you know Mr. Roboto by Styx? Does everyone know Mr. Roboto? You've never heard Mr. Roboto? Domo arigato, Mr. Anyway, it's this kind of this weird science fiction song about, I don't even know what it's about, but the end of the song is this crazy rock screaming part where it's like, the time has come at last, secret, secret, I got a secret, to throw away the mask, secret, secret, I got a secret, now everyone can see, it's operatic, and then it ends with, I'm Kilroy, Kilroy, Kilroy. So I'm talking to him and thinking, this can't be done. So I said no. And I said, call my buddy Ryan, he'll do it. He did do it. This other folky guy, he said it was the strangest thing he's ever done.
Was the deceased have a name of Boy? You know, like Kilroy?
I don't know. But the thing was, I wish I had said yes to that. It was around that time where I was starting to look at compromises as opportunities. I should have said, I will do it. and I'll figure out a way to sing Styx's Mr. Roboto in a chapel full of grieving people, you know. So that's what I keep trying to do. So that was my weird gig story. You didn't have a gig, but you had a story anyway.
Oh yeah, this one wasn't necessarily. Anyway, this is something that happened recently. As being an artist, I think yes, one of the main things is to say yes to stuff because you never know where that's going to lead. And I said yes to a gig where I was asked to help out for a film pilot for a TV series, and I was just asked to be a driver. So I was like, okay, I can drive, and this is film, so let's see what we can learn. And then I wasn't given much information until I just knew that I had to drive this one particular actor from where they were staying to the set and drive them back. And it was like 5 days out of 8, and super easy, it would help out wherever, yada, yada, yada. And it wasn't until I actually picked up this person that I learned from them that they are the foremost illusionist from Saudi Arabia. And they had just come to Canada to shoot this pilot, and that I was actually their guy for the week. Essentially, I was their personal assistant for the whole week, so I was driving this person and their fiance as well for pretty much all 8 of the days over that time. And yeah, and who knows where that may lead. There was talks of potentially working with them in Dubai. Yeah. This is, I don't know.
Anybody else have a weird gig story? Jamie Dupuy.
I do have one actually. When I was living in Hollywood, I met this man who lives in the Hollywood Hills. He collects a lot of guitars. I met him at Guitar Center. It's not a gig, but I was playing guitar, and he was intrigued by the music that I was playing. I was playing gypsy jazz. And he invited me over to his house, and since then it's led to like a friendship, and I go and visit him every year. But we did do this one gig for Bill Pullman. I don't know if you know, like he's the president in Independence Day.
Oh yeah.
He's the father in Casper.
Surfer the Rainbow?
So he does this event every year, and it's like a trumpets, sort of like music themed event. And my friend plays banjo, and we just tuned it into like a guitar tuning. And we ended up playing for his party, and it was kind of interesting. We talked to him a little bit, and it wasn't my style at all. I was just like trying to fit in and whatnot. So it was really cool to see him, and just the event was kind of different.
Cool.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, why don't we talk about our show and how we made it work?
Yeah, let's talk about some of the things that we learned about
Yeah.
working back in our hometown.
Yeah.
So particularly with this show, again, kind of touching on those points of the mandate and ensuring that we incorporate the community. One of the things that we had recognized is that's an important aspect. An example I can give, there's a theater company that was there called Common Roof, and they produced the show called White Rabbit, Red Rabbit, which is an incredible show. The premise being that an actor can only ever do this once in their life. They can't have seen it, read it, or heard anything about it. They show up on the night in front of an audience, are given an envelope with a script. They must open it and perform it in its entirety, and that's the experience. And so our friend, Nathan Carroll, had found 4 actors to do this. I was lucky enough to be asked to do the first night in the Waterford Old Town Hall. And then he had Lynn Griffin, Divine Brown, and Ian Lake as the other nights. So for theater people, those are huge names.
Yeah.
But the irony was, more people came to watch me because I was from that town than they came to watch any of these celebrities within the artistic community. So that was a big tip-off that the community is more related to those that they know than necessarily what we as artists may think are like big, momentous individuals, artists, or things of that sort. So with that in mind, we move forward to ensure that, like, for example, for the posters, we made sure that Claire and I were on the posters so that people knew that we were in it and we were going to be there. So they were relating to us.
Set in a barn, for God's sakes. You know? Like,
and that we work to get people from the community involved in various aspects as kind of like our lighting tech, musicians, people from the community to be playing music on stage, getting people within the community to like even how we engaged in sponsorships and things of that sort. We reached out to as many people as possible, gave away tickets with every sponsorship. In as many opportunities as possible, we would give tickets away to ensure people would like come see the show.
Yeah, so our ask packages were very like, if you give us X amount of hundreds of dollars, we will give you this amount of free tickets to a show. We will give you this space in our program. We will show you out after each show, like every single show that we do, and a special shout out at the opening night. So we were able to, like, you know, we went to our local radio station and said, hey, can you give us money? And we will shout you out, and we will give you free tickets, and you can come see the show. We went to our local internet. We did the exact same thing. And like, we had so much in-kind support.
Yes.
Because there is money to be found. It's just, and like help to be found. Because even if communities like ours that aren't specifically super arts heavy and arts focused, people still want there to be art. That's what we found. People get really excited. They just don't have anything to channel their excitement into. So if you give them something like a musical or a theater, they will support it wholeheartedly with either, you know, like people, they donated our, like the poster printing and like food and drink for our opening night. And so like they weren't necessarily just giving us money, but they were giving us their products in exchange to come support our show and being there. Like you said, at the end of the day, 25% of our tickets sales were comps.
Yeah. Yeah, but then...
But it doesn't matter.
But then we had full houses, and
Yeah.
that changes the entire experience of the show. And
Yeah.
more people would come back, and it creates a wonderful night at the theater.
Yeah.
And also, though, with getting sponsorships and things of this sort, one of the things that we found is that it's really in working where we live, again, going back to those relationships and the trust and things of that sort, for us, kind of like recognizing that like we are privileged in a lot of ways, and so moving through that community, it was really easy to knock on doors and like walk into a business and know the business owner and be able to
like,
start up a
"Hello."
conversation and tell them about the show. And
Yeah.
so-
We went into furniture stores and we're like, hi, can we borrow this bed frame? And they'd be like, sure.
Yeah.
Just return it in 2 weeks.
Yeah, so there's not necessarily a lot of infrastructure already built in this particular, where we're from, for theater particularly, but there is a lot of access to things to be able to kind of create the infrastructure that we need, or to like, essentially what we found it comes down to is leveraging the relationships that we have, because what we find in Norfolk County particularly is that the community, the interpersonal relationships are what really drive the community. And so by leveraging those and utilizing those, we're able to transform that into a product, a performance, something of that sort. And then any money that we were able to raise, we can then push that into paying our artists. We can ensure that like the space that we have is being rented and things of that sort, and it allows growth that way.
Yeah.
So despite the fact that there may not be a lot of, say, technicians and actors and people with the time available to focus on working on a professional production for several weeks in Norfolk County, there are things, there's so much that can be used.
Yeah, in surprising ways, like Tanya, who's a circus performer, she came into our rehearsal room at one point, and we were like, oh man, we really need like something that looked like a boat. We need a boat for the scene. She's like, I can make you a boat. I've got stuff, I've got materials. She made us a boat. We didn't even ask. She just kind of volunteered, which is fun. Things you don't find in the city so much.
Yeah, it's a different community in the city.
Yeah.
But even on that hand, I know people who've lived in Toronto their entire life, and they have a community like that.
Yeah.
It's because that's where they spent 20 plus years of their life fostering these relationships. And so they have the infrastructure and the network there to support them in their artistic endeavor, and they're very successful.
Yeah.
So I think there's something to recognize that in the places where we come from, there is a network there is support there that we can access because of this. And not to say this works for everybody, not to say this works in every necessarily town or community, but based on our relationship with the people in our town and like the color of our skin and our abilities and things of this sort.
Yeah, and the nice thing is that like you were saying earlier, that in the cities there is a framework for producing theater. And it's a framework that I'm very familiar with. I produce a lot of theater and I create a lot of theater. And there isn't so much a framework for creating theater in rural areas, but that can be useful because that means that you can just make it work however you want to, / however works, which I think is quite freeing.
Yeah.
So do you mean by that, like you can be very experimental with your theater work? Like it could be like a show that no one has heard before, like an original show, or? That's something
we've been finding to be an interesting challenge. Because we were talking the other day about like because with Norfolk County, what they're used to are comedies and farces and stuff that is fairly tame, I would say. And I think coming from our background of like going to theater school and living in major metropolitan areas and experiencing theater that you would just not experience in smaller rural town communities, we're like, we would really love to bring this stuff here. But we also know that not all of it is going to be immediately accepted. And so it's that line between like, how do you broaden people's minds and their horizons while also keeping the trust that you're wanting to build with them in terms of like, they're not going to come to your show that you're doing and be tricked into seeing something that's going to be considered horribly offensive or, to them. So, sorry.
I think if we're looking at our first show, I think people came because they're like, nobody knew what the last 5 years was.
Yeah.
But they're like, but Ryan and Clare are doing it, so we trust them, so we're gonna go watch that.
Yeah.
Now, if they didn't like the show,
yeah,
they probably won't come see the next show that we do because that's played with their trust.
Yeah.
But I think on another example, we have somebody who runs the Waterford Old Town Hall, and she's been doing incredible work there. And she's been doing a concert series, and she's been working really hard in like bringing in folks that people from the county may not necessarily know, but because they trust Clare, they'll come and buy tickets to all the shows because they know that they're going to like the shows because they trust Clare, and Clare has proven time and time again that whatever she puts on, people like. So there's...
But is there like a sort of criteria that you guys follow, or...
For the type of show?
Yeah.
No. I think it just
there are criteria.
Well, yes, there are criteria. Yeah. But I think we're still figuring
where we can
go and how we can push and like with the end goal being like there are some shows that we would love to put up in Norfolk County. We spent a lot of time reading a bunch of plays recently in consideration for future plays that we put up, and there were some that were like, this is amazing, we don't think it will be accepted. How do we get there? How do we get to that point?
Yeah. But I also think if we're doing something in a community, and especially with theater, I have a strong belief that when somebody is producing something in theater, it's because they believe that story needs to be told now. And if they're going to be producing it in a particular place, that they believe that story needs to be told to that particular audience as well. So that audience needs to hear that story.
Yeah.
So with that, by extension, whatever we're producing has to like meet the community in some way, where they are.
Yeah.
So we can't necessarily, but there's a whole bunch of places where we can meet the community. We can meet them through content, through types of shows that they've seen, but maybe presented in a new style, in a new place, so they don't feel
like them.
alienated, or like create a show, that is that they've seen a bunch of times, but then have a more culturally diverse cast. But we can't alienate our audience in a whole bunch of ways and expect them still to trust us, because it's a back and forth. But there's always a way, I believe, that we can stretch, but we have to meet somewhere first and then kind of like show where they can go from there.
Yeah,
as opposed to like ending up over here and being like, you should be over here, why aren't you with us when they're over here?
Yeah.
So,
but I'm sure since you've started, like you've grown to do a lot of more like diverse theater work.
Well, we're looking at it.
Yeah.
So we've done one and we're working on our second.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then I guess for you as well, you seem with like the gypsy jazz. Are you playing more of that in Sudbury? Or?
Well, I play a lot of different styles. Like I've been through, like I studied classical, I've studied jazz, but now I'm more into like just experimental music. Like not necessarily, but like it's just because I take so many different styles of music, and I like to write in my own way in that style, right? Like we kind of have a similar style, Kevin and I. Like I don't do the vocals, but he does a finger style approach on the guitar, and I've done that for a long time, and I do originals. And then I recently got onto the harp guitar, which is a guitar that has extra bass strings on it, and it's been around for over 100 years, but it's not a popular instrument that ever caught the mainstream audience. And recently, my videos online have been getting like millions of views and whatnot, so it's kind of like grown into like a niche in some way. But I have, like, the reason I ask these questions is that I've had very difficult time in like my small areas trying to present this kind of music, because people would always approach me and they'd be like, well, do you know how to sing this song, or do you know this song? And I would never sort of like do that. Like, I tried for a little bit, but then I like noticed like this is really just not me. Like, I got to go back to my weird stuff, you know. Like, and since then, like, it's grown to a bigger audience, and especially online, where you can always meet your target audience. So whatever you do on the internet, you're gonna find your audience one of these days. But in a community, that can be very difficult, because, like we were saying, like, if you start a show, like just your first show, and it's just something totally weird and no one likes it, then people aren't going to be talking about it, right? So
you have to be careful, and you have to be thoughtful, and you have to consider the needs of your community, which is something we were talking about, like, going forward, being like, let's ask our community what they want to see, and how do we both cater to them and also do our own thing. I mean, that comes back to the idea of not so much compromise, but like working together.
Or as you're saying, your second point, what is your responsibility to the people around you?
Exactly.
Because that's and maybe this is one thing that I found important for me leaving Norfolk County and spending time in Toronto and spending time in Montreal and other places is being open to different perspectives and lifestyles and cultures and things of that sort, which we do not readily come across. And so I find in Norfolk County that there is still a lot of xenophobia, a lot of racism, a lot of homophobia, a lot of sexism. There's like a lot of this stuff there, even though it's a beautiful place and the people are, like, at their core, really
Good
wonderful
people.
and genuine people. So for me, part of that concept is like, what is my responsibility to this community is to, like, also, you know, bring that stuff to light.
Mm-hmm.
Because being in the county, people don't have to see all of that, even though it's there in the county. There's a huge underground LGBTQIA community that doesn't come out because they're scared of losing their jobs, or they're scared of
Even
a
on
bunch
high
of
school
things.
level.
On a
Like,
whole bunch of
the
levels.
amount of friends who came out after high school that I had no idea about, because
Yeah.
it's just not the kind of
It's
environment.
not a safe space at all to do. So there's, so for us and for me, a combination of that responsibility is like, again, how do we meet our community? How do we take these things that we've learned from outside of the community and hope to, like, help and give back in some way and see where that leads?
And I think also, if I can just jump in
Yeah.
here, one of the things that I have been involved with is theater that reflects the community in which you live, and telling stories about the community, either historical or current or future or whatever. And those are the kinds of stories that people want to hear and be a part of. And, you know, if you can add in the fact that perhaps it's a local writer and a local actor who are performing, then that will attract your audience. And as you say, you don't want to offend your audience, you don't want to alienate them, you don't want to turn them away. You will never please everybody all the time. Get over that one very quickly. But if you tell stories of your community, as you heard yesterday, I was involved with an organization in Collingwood, which is a population of 20,000, and they put on an event, a theatrical event every year, which told stories of the community, and they would sell out 600 tickets in 24 hours. And people flocked to it. They loved it. And, you know, there were some challenges in presenting it, particularly because the audience was moving from place to place to place, and it was in November, and you never knew what kind of weather you're going to have. If people are walking along the street on a Saturday night, and it's, you know, there's a snow squall coming in off Georgian Bay. But they did. because they were paying to see stories that were about themselves or their ancestors or an industry like the shipyards industry in Collingwood was the economic base of that town for 100 years. And one year the theme of this whole event was the shipyards. So you tell stories about the community.
Yeah.
You know, I realize that, I came into this probably more, as usual, kind of self-therapy. It might be just the singer-songwriter in me. But, my take on Bloom Where You're Planted was more facing any kind of self-imposed limitations on what I could accomplish, and which is why I brought up, compromise as opportunity. I've always just been a singer-songwriter, and that's all I was. It was like very solitary, kind of a path. There is no organization. There is no community, really. You're just, you're writing your songs on your own, and then every now and then you're kind of like on a stage and you're sharing what you got. But the reason I brought this and my guitar is not to annoy everybody with like 4 minutes of music you weren't expecting to hear, was that, lately I think I have like the perfect example of almost an extreme blooming where you're planted. And it also has to do with my limitations. It has to do with, especially has to do with compromise. And turn that into an opportunity, which I think could work, with organizations in small communities and theater in small communities. But so a few years ago, I took a job on a cruise ship, and cruise ships to musicians, it's always kind of maybe not looked down on, but musicians aren't really, there aren't a lot of famous cruise ship musicians. It's a tough gig.
On the cruise ship.
Yeah, and so, but I took the gig because I really needed the gig. Like, to sign a 2-month contract on a ship meant that I didn't have to struggle and find work in, singing Mr. Roboto at a funeral. So I took the gig. Luckily, it was actually for an adventure cruise company, so the ship actually is in the Arctic and Antarctica. Nevertheless, when I got on the ship, I realized that I was just playing in the pub. And the operations manager who hired me said, I had kind of pitched her, I was a singer-songwriter, and she said, you can't play original songs on the ship. This is a pub, people want to hear American Pie and Brown Eyed Girl. So right away I'm like, that's the thing I don't want to do. But when I got on the ship, what I suddenly realized that there was like an opportunity to kind of turn this fairly mundane job into something else that I could bring back and incorporate into a career. And so I had an iPhone, and I could take pictures of some of the things I was seeing. And then I realized that, well, maybe if I write songs about some of this stuff, I can kind of maybe change my career path a bit and become like the guy who goes to the Arctic and sings songs and takes pictures of the Arctic. So I was planted on a ship in the high Norwegian Arctic, 500 nautical miles from the North Pole. And I've been trying to turn that into something that I can sell. I thought this was actually going to play by itself. Ryan, would you like...
You want me to just press it on
just
like a
like
3-second count?
every 5 seconds. Now, normally I show this when I'm doing the song. So I just play the songs I have written, but I just now have a picture that goes with them. So you'll see titles of songs, but this is just images that I've taken. I'm a non-photographer. And I'm going to play a tune that I wrote. Talk about compromise. I was in this, leading a hike, and I had my iPad, and it was before we went to the Arctic. We were in Norway, and I just was recording, this river, because I thought, there's a babbling brook. And then I noticed there was a bird in the background making this song, and I just found it very haunting. And so I started to try to write a piece of music that I could play for all my slides. So this is it. I stole this technique from Janie Dupuy, actually. Seriously. do with the Arctic. This is a story I tell. You can flip through these fast. A friend of mine painted these pictures based on a story I wrote. Forgot about this.